Welcome to another episode of What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Madden, a partner here at Penta. This is a big week for Penta. Yesterday, we announced that Penta has acquired Hume Brophy, a global public affairs, communications, and strategy firm that's headquartered in Dublin. As a result, Penta, the world's first comprehensive stakeholder solution firm, is now a global stakeholder solutions firm with offices in Dublin, Brussels, Paris, Frankfurt, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And that's in addition to our current offices in the US and London. The Hume Brophy team now joins Penta on the strategy side of our business. So we're really excited about this partnership because now Penta can expand our reach into new regions and deepen our expertise and offerings in sectors such as energy, transportation, agriculture, and financial services. Joining me to talk about this news and some of the biggest issues facing our clients in Europe and Asia are Conall McDevitt and Jill Craig. Conall is now managing director at Penta Europe and Asia after serving as CEO of Hume Brophy. Jill Craig is the managing director in Brussels, where she specializes in advising clients on European Union related issues. Conall, Jill, welcome to Penta and the What's at Stake podcast.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So let's jump right in. Conall, I'm going to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what this acquisition brings to the table for Penta?
This is really important, I think, because what we've been about over the past 18 years in Hume Brophy is building the best integrated corporate communications and government relations firm in sectors that are highly regulated globally around the world, like financial services, transport, agriculture and food, as well as financial services, and so on and so forth. By joining up with Penta, by becoming part of Penta, two things are happening that we feel are really exciting. The first is that we're getting to join up with colleagues on the strategy side of the business who we feel are just like us in the United States, people like you, Kevin, people who have got careers of providing excellent advice at the most senior level to international firms across the federal and state level in the United States. But also, I'm really, really excited for us, is the idea of becoming part of a consultancy that also has a really innovative, cutting edge intelligence arm driven by data insights and research capabilities. And we believe, particularly in Europe and in Asia, there is a massive market opportunity for the intelligence part of the Penta business as well as our strategy stuff. So for us, this is not just a great strategic integration of two strategy businesses, but it's also the opportunity to be real kind of groundbreakers and innovators in Europe and Asia by bringing the intelligence offer also to the marketplace.
So I'd love to follow up with you on that, and Jill, jump in here with some of your ideas, but it's the intelligence part of it that I wanted to sort of drill down on. You know, a lot of what we talk about here, and we've all had these conversations as we've started to think about how we integrate, a lot of our focus has been like, how do we stay one step ahead in our business? And how do we help our clients and the industries that are dealing with these regulatory regimes at both the EU and in the US? How do we keep them one step ahead? What do you think are some of the ways that the intelligence component of what we do here at Penta will do that?
So let me take the first bit of this, and I'm sure Jill will jump in. But I mean, if you think about the ability to be able to track sentiment, stakeholder sentiment for a large corporation, for example, in Europe and Asia, what are we really saying? For example, a large bank. We now have the ability to be able to track how your investors are thinking about you, how your customers are thinking about you, how your regulators are thinking about you, how the politicians and policymakers who make the rules that will ultimately be the regulations are thinking about you, and how the wider kind of citizenry, the people who are constantly questioning your reputation, are thinking about you. And we can then go really deep with certain parts or certain groups within that sort of community. We can go really deep and start investigating in great depth what, for example, politicians think about. And we can bring all of that data out into the firm on an evidence base for the first time. And we can offer you the opportunity to test what you do in the public affairs or public relations space against a benchmark that is evidence-based. But we can also provide you with the level of insight that just doesn't exist in our profession. One of the things about our profession historically that I think we all have to acknowledge is that it was as much about who you knew and what you knew about what the evidence for anything that you had was. In other words, we all traded on our reputations. I used to do this, Kevin, you used to do this on the Hill, Jill, you used to do that. And as a result of what we did once in politics or in government somewhere else, we were considered reputable advisors. In the world of Penta, that still is there, and that's important. But we also have, for the first time really seriously in our industry, access to data to support every decision and every piece of advice we give to our clients, and our clients are able to use independently.
Yeah. And you're talking about those instances. So Jill, I remember being in Meetings where oftentimes where maybe a wrong decision was being made or a decision that we believed was maybe taking in the wrong direction. And it was usually made on instinct. And instincts are good, right? Experience drives instincts, but sometimes those instincts, and I think this is particularly the case with the media. The media sort of misjudges public sentiment and public reactions, and oftentimes they gear their coverage in a certain way because of it. But now instinct's not enough. Instead, we have to have data and we have to have a backing in research in order to make really good decisions.
I think that's right. I mean, obviously, instincts are great. And as you say, they come with experience and knowledge of the sector you're in and the region you're in. But I suspect that also a lot of these decisions made by big global companies are made perhaps too often at regional level, where you have your European experts or your US experts. And what's great about what we can do now together is actually bring insight that goes across those geographies as well and shows a much higher level picture about the evidence that's there to suggest perhaps a different approach for a corporate across the different areas where it has business. And I think that's really exciting.
So in our most recent collaborations, as we got ready to bring Hume Brophy into the Penta family, we talked a lot about some of the work that we were excited to collaborate on. And one of the things I was struck by was just how deep your experience is across a broad range of issues that are really top of mind when it comes to looking at how global companies are navigating today's political environment and policy environment. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the areas where you're really deep and where you really spent a lot of time over the last years working at high levels in policy development and strategy?
So Brussels has been always quite a policy wonked kind of place. And as a result of that, as Conall said, we've been focused on those areas that are heavily regulated. So transport, energy, agri-food, trade, financial services, these are our key industry sectors. But what's been really fascinating to see over recent times is how those things have all become interrelated, and that you can no longer say that you only work on transportation, say, or that you only work on energy, because these things have become so blurred. And especially now, even with financial services and a focus on ESG or sustainable finance, as we've seen significantly in Europe, these things have brought the financial services sector much more into other areas, industry sectors that perhaps in a policy sense that they were not connected to before. So I think that has put us in Hume Brophy in a very good place, because we were already doing all of those things already. And therefore we already viewed them in a way as connected. So we've been a little bit ahead of the game, I think, there in being able to see where the connections are, how those things interrelate, and to be able to bring a level of experience and of other sectors to some of our clients who perhaps have been focused very much in one sector and don't have a kind of read across into other areas that we do because of the variety of different sectors that we work with.
Conall?
Yeah, there's a phrase that we hear talk about a lot called unconscious bias. You hear it in the workplace around questions of equality and diversity in the workplace and stuff. But a bit like what you were saying a few minutes ago, Kevin, there's a massive amount of unconscious bias in the public affairs and corporate communications world, right up to the very top. In the same way as every level of government everywhere in the world, it is just littered with unconscious bias by definition, and sometimes very conscious, deliberate bias because of political differences. What we're going to be able to do is something really exciting, which is to cut through all of that and to look at an evidence base that we're able to then say to a large multinational organization, whether it be a firm or a large trade organization or even a sovereign government. I will say to them, okay, so there's a lot of noise flying around this issue in Brussels or in DC or in the United Kingdom now after Brexit or over in Asia. And all that noise is what dominates the headlines. But let's look at what actually is driving that debate. And let's look at what the 4 or 5 or 40 or 50 critical decision makers really think. And let's ask ourselves whether they are being driven by the noise or whether actually they're pursuing quietly an agenda that the noise is, if you like, drowning out. And I'm so excited about our ability, as Jill says, to be able to take what we considered already to be a really integrated offer between really great government relations, regulatory affairs and corporate communications, and to add to that this great intelligence capability. And to be able to do it not just where we're already good, which is in Europe and Asia, but to be able to do it globally, Kevin. And, when you look at the world we're in this week, the events in Congress over the past 7 days, the terrible events in Brasilia, overnight as we're recording this podcast. And you just realize how interconnected this world we're living in has become. how small it has become.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about policy issues, but actually so many of them have become a lot less technical and a lot more geopolitical over the last year or so. And I think that, that brings an edge that lends itself to some opinions and unconscious bias, as you call it, Conall, instinct, if you want to call it that is not necessarily focused or based in the facts. And so having that evidence level, I think, is going to be even more critical than in the past.
Also, Jill, on that point, I think an integrated strategy, I think many of the organizations or industries or companies, but I'll call them organizations in order to sort of offer a bit more of a blanket analysis here. They sort of focused on the first 5 feet in front of them, and they believed that, their U.S. strategy could be cordoned off from what they had to do globally. And maybe even some of the folks in EU said, we're going to avoid the noise of the Trump effect in Washington and the instability of the U.S. political dialogue right now, and just focus on what we're doing here in the EU. It's a mistake to do that. And I think you have all seen that now as we've collaborated across the pond with each other, how important an integrated strategy and integrated approach is to your global political and global regulatory environments.
100%. I mean, social media at the most basic level of this debate and discussion, social media is a global phenomenon. Yeah, it represents itself within communities of interest that might be geographic, but then they may not be, Kevin, right? You could be part of a community of interest in social media that's just about aircraft or being an airline pilot or an interest in a particular aspect of science. And so many of these conversations are not being properly followed. And so many of these conversations, frankly, are being ignored by organizations, global organizations, because they're not immediately in front of them, because actually oftentimes they're not even visible to them. But it is those conversations where oftentimes you are seeing either the great opportunities to build and enhance your reputation over a long period of time, or indeed some of the greatest risks, because that's where some of the big problems fester. That's where they incubate before they become viral and get out there. And the idea, as Jill said, that, what's happened in Brasilia overnight won't have an impact on the Mercosur Trade Organization. It will.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I think back to November, one of our first collaborations as a team, when we offered a breakdown and analysis of the U.S. elections and the impact over the immediate term. I was very surprised to see how high the interest was from the EU and what was going on here in the U.S. And if you think about what's happened in the interim, right, which is the fracas that we've seen over the last week, just electing a speaker, what that tells you about the current state of the legislative process and the political environment here in the U.S. and how that's going to affect decision-making over the next 2 years. It's good to see that we have higher interest now. And that's why I think a team like ours that's integrated is really going to make a big difference for clients. Or with that, I want to get some insights from you all on what's going on in the EU. What do you think are the key developments in both the EU and Asia that we should be watching? For our listeners out there that want to stay one step ahead, Jill and Conall, what are some of the things that we should be watching?
Well, let me kick off with Europe, and then we can talk a bit about Asia. We have a war on our continent that is high on everyone's agenda, obviously, and that is leading to a number of significant changes, not least in energy supply. So we have something of an energy crisis. We're trying to move towards a more supplying way of heating and powering ourselves. And that's going to have significant consequences in some countries more than others across Europe. And you align that then also with a food security issue, food prices increasing, inflation and so on, that are also at least partly war related, but there are some other factors behind that too, meaning that the cost of living is actually very high on everyone's agenda in the EU. And from a political point of view, the EU institutions, as the Brussels-led part of the EU, if I can call it that, is still very ambitious on all things climate and sustainability. And this is becoming increasingly conflictual because others are pushing for the level of ambition to be reduced because of all the other crises that we're trying to fight at the same time. Whereas at the Brussels institution level, the idea is very much that we should continue to keep our level of ambition, also to hold the rest of the world to account. So these are the kind of critical issues which affect all industry sectors and citizens at all levels. So yeah, these are the things that are keeping us awake at night here.
So Jill, I've talked a little bit about some of the instability here in the U.S. political system. So I should ask a little bit about some of the instability in the EU system with the corruption scandal that we've seen. It's made a lot of news in U.S.-based reporting. What do you think the impact there is going to be on the level of production? And is it going to continue to be a distraction, or is it just a little bit of noise and most folks are going about their business policymaking?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think the reality is that most people are just getting on with it. There's an ongoing investigation by the Belgian authorities. There's at least one member of the European Parliament that is still in jail, pending next moves by the justice system. So while I think that is deeply unhelpful, of course, to Europe's vision of itself and the way it likes to project itself across the rest of the world as a home of democracy and, integrity, I think in terms of getting things done on a day-to-day basis, it's business as usual.
So, Conall, I want to turn to you a little bit on the Asia front and learn a little bit about what you think is top of mind over there. Because right now, competition between the U.S. and China, it's always tense and it continues to intensify. What's the European view of that competition? Has the sentiment toward China in European capitals grown more confrontational as it has here?
It's much more nuanced in Europe than it would be in the United States. And again, it depends on where in Europe you're thinking about, because whilst we've talked about the European Union, we haven't talked about the United Kingdom, of course, which is no longer part of the European Union, but still plays a significant geopolitical role on the continent of Europe. And so, for example, the attitudes towards China play out differently at the UK level, where you have somewhat of an alignment, particularly on the right, ideologically, would say the right of the Republican Party in the United States of America, and a slightly more hawkish approach towards China than, say, for example, in some of the very large mainland European countries like Germany or Spain or France or Italy, where you might take a much more pragmatic and sort of longer term view towards China. Interestingly, a small member state like Ireland is kind of oftentimes the canary in the coal mine on something like this, because Ireland would take a very nuanced view towards China from a trade point of view and much less binary, if you like, than what you would see reflected, in the United States or certainly in the UK. And then thinking about Asia, I mean, the first thing is it's a massive place, like all of our continents are. And so, when we think about our world in Penta, we've got colleagues in Hong Kong, which is obviously North Asia, part of Greater China. You're looking at a very different sort of world to colleagues in Singapore, which is in Southeast Asia. And maybe starting up in Hong Kong, I guess the thing that will dominate life in Hong Kong over the next year or so will be the emergence from the pandemic, which is only, of course, happening now. And I think a series of questions about Hong Kong's place in the world. Does it continue to be that bridgehead between, the market economy and the common law, system and mainland China? Or does it actually become a little more integrated? And then when you think about Hong Kong within its region, there's some very exciting stuff taking place through what's known as the Greater Bay Initiative, which is about connecting Hong Kong and Macau and all those new cities in Guangzhou and Shenzhen in that sort of part of China. And there is some very, very interesting and very exciting sort of innovation and research-led industry going on in that space. But of course, it's all caught up in or part of that bigger, huge, big game of chess that's playing out now between China and the rest of the world. Southeast Asia is a totally different place. It's a totally different place. You've got amazing countries like, Thailand and Malaysia and Vietnam and Indonesia, which are huge and very fast growing economies, like exceptionally fast growing economies. And our team there, Singapore is very much the hub at the center of Southeast Asia when it comes to our world, when it comes to the world of regulation, because Singapore, even though it's a very small country, does an awful lot of the heavy lift in a regulatory sense for that part of the world. And also it's the media capital and it's the financial capital of that part of the world. So what I would say for us, thinking about it from the Penta world, thinking about it from, our world as the comprehensive stakeholder, solutions advisor and insights people, there's so much fascinating data for us to trawl over and to analyze on behalf of our clients and our future clients about really what's happening in Asia and what Asia's relationship with the rest of the world really is. Is it what we read in the headlines of the Times in London or Le Monde or the Washington Post, or is it in fact much more nuanced?
Yeah, well, the headlines right now, I think, are very focused on COVID policy in Asia, China's COVID policy and some of the COVID policies elsewhere. But the last time I was in Asia, when I was in Singapore, one of the biggest, most important topics of anything related to Asia and U.S. relations was trade. And I still marvel at some of the media outlets here in the U.S., like the Washington Post recently talking about how what the United States needs is a more open and a better, more innovative approach on the issue of trade. Now, here at Penta, we worked on Trade Promotion Authority and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which were geared towards doing exactly that. So here we are a couple of years later, we're still talking about how we need something like a Trans-Pacific Partnership on trade. How likely do you think it is that we're going to make advancements on Asia-U.S. trade policy?
I think there are a series of very big macroeconomic drivers that are forcing us to make these advancements. Whether politically they come easily or not is of course, a different question. And, we can't ignore the composition of the U.S. Congress now and, the impact.
And we've talked about that as a team, how we're heading into an election cycle where I think being tough on China is top of mind, but some of these trade policies have very populist streaks that play with certain constituents here in the U.S. But go ahead.
But the U.S. was supposed to be in TPP, right? I mean, There is a TPP, but just now without the U.S.
Exactly right.
And the big problems don't go away, folks, would be what I would say. Like the big macroeconomic and macro environmental and macro social challenges that we as a world, as a little planet are going to face ain't going away. And until someone comes up with a better solution, oftentimes the most effective way of addressing these is through pragmatic trade relationships, which gets the best out of everyone in all parts of the world, right? And creates a fair level playing ground through which prosperity can be shared out globally. I think the one thing that COP, which comes around every year now, and the debate doesn't change and the problems don't get any smaller, keeps reminding us is that trade will be an absolutely integral part of the solution in terms of the big existential crisis facing us as a civilization, as humanity. And I just think when you look at it from Penta's point of view, our job is to be advisors. Our job is to support our clients, whoever they may be and whatever agenda they may have. But the facts don't go away. And the facts are becoming so obvious that these things are global problems and these things now require global solutions. And therefore having the data that gives you the confidence to be able to say, well, actually they are. And that's the way the vast majority of people, when you go beyond their politics, feel about them, feel also, will allow us, I think, to be able to provide great advice there in that space.
I think it goes back to that geopolitics piece as well. I mean, Europe very much used to see itself, literally in the middle between the US and China on all things trade. And it would agree with the US on some things like human rights, technology, these sorts of things. But on the other hand, it would lean more towards China on some other things against the US on things like the WTO as a rules-based trading system and even climate change and those kinds of topics. But all of that has slightly shifted now, not least because the US has become more hardline towards China and the EU has done the same given China's support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the idea of there being a kind of three-party, system that everyone's keeping each other in check is slightly wobbly at the moment. And that is an interesting place to be.
I think, Jill, you're right. I think some of this really does depend on turning the Klee lights on U.S. policy on trade, and that if there's going to be changes, it'll have to come from here probably. To Conall's point, when my son made a very similar argument the other day, when he won an argument with me, he said, "Dad, facts don't care about your feelings." So this is all true. I'm going to do something very different here. I'm going to turn the questioning around to you all. What does the Hume Brophy team have for the podcast hosts as we now become one team at Penta?
So listen, we've been listening in for a few months now to the podcast, and it's wonderful. And there aren't too many in our space, people like us talking about issues from our perspective. And one of the things that I'm asking, Kevin, of yourself and colleagues stateside is that we turn this into a global podcast. That we talk about things from all perspectives and that we hear Asian voices, we hear European voices, that we disagree from time to time because, as your son says, facts are facts, or as my daughter likes to say, it's true facts, dads, that we're interested in. I think when you get to our age in life, sometimes you become a bit immune from the true fact life and you like to be in the true prejudice life.
Right.
Because that's the way that's easier. So, I mean, my request here is that we're able to bring a conversation every week to our friends and whoever wants to tune in about some of the most interesting things that are going on in the world from a truly global perspective, and to be able to always put those data insights out there to the extent that we can, and to sort of shake up the way our industry and our sector is perceived, not just about what you know or who you know, but also about, how important data is in all of this.
Yeah, I think that's true. And the thing that I'm most excited about is doing this in real time, like having these conversations regularly, because so many things are happening so quickly. And when you try to learn a little bit about, okay, well, what's the EU-US link here? Or what are the most recent conversations or top of line strategies or insights about the US and Asia? And there's not a whole lot out there. And I think we can fill that space pretty well with some of the experience and thoughts and ideas and perspectives that we have as a full Penta team now.
I think from our point of view, looking into the US, one of the questions that keeps coming back is, how are you going to get anything done? It seems to be, a bit dysfunctional with the way the Congress is set up, and obviously coming into the second half of the president's term. What do you see as being the top things that could still be achieved, or that the Biden administration might actually want to achieve in the time that's left?
Well, the number one issue on everybody's mind, Jill, is still the economy, right? As you head into a 2024 presidential election, the trend line on the economy is going to dictate who keeps or maintains political majorities or maintains the White House. So I think that's the main thing. And when we spoke in November, one of the big concerns we had was that the Republican Republican-controlled House of Representatives was going to have a very heavy emphasis on oversight and investigations and, what they call an accountability agenda against the Biden White House. And there is some opportunities there for them to, shape maybe some popular ideas on things like the COVID response or something like that. But I think the American public and elections overall are always about the future. And the future concern here is about how do we strengthen the economy. So some of those investigations and oversight may seem out of step with an American public that's very focused on jobs, keeping costs down, and economic growth and prosperity. So that's the thing that we're watching very closely. If you look at the speaker fracas, as I've called it over the last week, it's made for good TV. I never knew that C-SPAN, you could turn in and watch a drama on C-SPAN. But the thing that demonstrates is these votes for speaker, they used to be part of a pageantry. They used to be just process. And now they've turned into very difficult votes. And that should be the easy stuff. Imagine what the hard stuff is going to look like when it comes to things like debt limit and appropriations bills. So the lesson I offer to clients, both here and in the EU and in Asia, is get ready for operating within the 45 yard lines of American politics. Every single vote is going to be a chore. Every single big piece of legislation in Washington is going to come down to the last vote. And how you engage your stakeholders, either for or against that, is going to be key to having industries or organizations navigate today's political environment.
And when you look at what happened in the United Kingdom over the past 3 years, you see a variation on the same theme, don't you? This sort of psychodramatic politics. Yeah.
It was only a few months ago that we were all watching the Prime Minister debate in the
era of Trussonomics was over before.
all 10 days, right?
All 40 odd days, exactly. But the thing that's really interesting, there's a winter of discontent now in the UK. Okay, so there's a lot of strikes going on in the railways. The nurses, the teachers are talking about going out as well. The post office workers, the post people are going out. And what I find very interesting about it, Kevin, and it's where again what we do in Penta will be really valuable to our clients, is beneath the psychodrama, life goes on. And ordinary working people begin to get pretty peeved off when they realize that government is consumed with the psychodrama rather than dealing with today, day in, day out, bread and butter issues like, public services and all these things that we look to government to deliver for us. And I think to your point about managing Congress for the next 2 years, it's about managing the bits of Congress that won't be caught up in that and understanding and identifying what those bits are, what those issues are. And of course, being able to provide an evidence base, to the organizations we partner with that gives them a degree of reassurance that if they invest time and energy in this issue with these people, they'll maybe avoid some of the psychodrama. But it's very easy for any issue to get sucked up into it, isn't it? For it to get kind of elevated up into being like a big political headline issue, like is happening at the moment, for example, with the strikes in the UK. It's a terrible tragedy to watch it unfold, but that's life, and that's the way politics is playing out in the UK and in the US, and dare I say it'll probably play out in Italy in the next few months in that way as well, given the shape of the government, and it certainly plays out in Hungary that way these days, and in big chunks of Southeast Asia it plays out that way as well. It's a really, really interesting time to be doing our job.
I think that's a good summary. We're going to have lots of psychodrama, lots of additional fracases, lots of additional political volatility. And right in the middle of it is going to be the Penta team, using our intelligence, using our research, using our strategy capabilities to help organizations manage it. Conall, Jill, thank you so much for joining the show today. And thanks to our listeners for tuning into this edition of What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. Hope you tune in next week or you visit us at pentagroup.co to learn more.
Thank you for listening to What's at Stake. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at PentaGRP and follow us on the web at penta.co.